Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to The World This Week with me, Anas Al-Tikriti. It's been 10 years since war broke out in Darfur in Sudan, and 2 years since the secession of South Sudan was fully ratified. After several decades of brutal fighting and many thousands of lives lost, is there now a realistic prospect of both North and South Sudan establishing viable economies and state infrastructures? Just last year, North and South Sudan appeared to be on the brink of war once again. But this month we have seen several developments which aim to ease the tensions between the former enemies. Here's more on these advances.
This month saw Sudanese President Bashir make his first visit to South Sudan since it split off from his country in 2011. On Tuesday, the two countries agreed to open 10 crossings along their joint border to boost travel and trade. Sudan had closed much of the 1,200-mile boundary after South Sudan's secession, which has affected traders and communities on both sides of the disputed line. The neighbours have also agreed to resume pumping oil through pipelines from south to north. It is hoped that the recent thaw in relations between the long-time foes will signal a new era of peace between the two countries.
كل يوم إن شاء الله حيشوف العلاقة دي متطورة من حسن لأحسن ونحن طبعا إن شاء الله بنتوقع قريبا إن شاء الله الأخ سلفة في الخرطوم عشان أيضا نؤكد فعلا المؤكد أن هذه العلاقة إن طالت الأمام ولن ترجع إلى الخلف إن شاء الله.
Last year, South Sudan offered £2 billion to Sudan in compensation for its loss of oil revenue in the secession. This week, the International Monetary Fund urged Sudan to divert this money to back reforms that will provide the government with more reliable revenue streams. But campaigners question how useful it is to initiate development in Sudan while it still faces problems within its borders too. It's been 10 years since war broke out in Darfur, and conflict is still prevalent today. More people were displaced by a surge of violence in January than in the whole of last year. And on Friday, a Nigerian peacekeeper was shot dead. The UNAMID soldier was killed by an armed man suspected to be part of a pro-government militia. The Sudanese Foreign Ministry says the perpetrator has nothing to do with the Sudan armed forces. Clearly, Sudan still has a long way to go to achieve lasting peace and stability, but the latest exchanges between North and South may be a step in the right direction.
Now, the UK has pledged £67 million in aid to Sudan, at least half of which will go to Darfur, where over half the population still receives food aid. So will the investments in Sudan and easing of tensions with the South help Sudan stabilise itself? With me to discuss the issues at stake is Public Affairs Consultant Dr. David Hoile, who is currently a research professor at Sudan International University in Khartoum and has written several books on the country. Also joining us is Mukesh Kapila, who is Professor of Global Health and Humanitarian Affairs at the University of Manchester and was head of the United Nations in Sudan in 2003. And last but not least, we have Olivia Warham, who is with us today, and she is Director of Waging Peace, an organisation which campaigns against human rights violations, particularly in Africa. Welcome to you all and thank you very much for joining us. Olivia, let me start with you. The report shows that we're talking today about two things. We're talking about North-South Sudan tensions, and we're talking about Darfur after 10 years. The question is, have we done with the prospects of war and conflict and the breakout of violence? Have we done with all that, or are we still there? I mean, where are we right now? Where is Sudan?
Well, I think the two issues have got one thing in common, which is that there is still conflict happening in both. Darfur, as was mentioned, the violence this year has seen an upsurge. The information that we're getting back from Darfuris that we speak to all the time here in the UK, who have friends and family there, is that the violence is more chaotic. UNAMID are as ineffective as ever, and they are very unprotected. The camp life is miserable for people. There are very few facilities. The Khartoum government continues to block access to many of the NGOs who are working there, who are finding it very difficult to operate. And a similar situation is happening in South Kordofan and Blue Nile on the south of Sudan, on the border with South Sudan. So the conflict is not moving on. It's not going. We are still looking at this situation where we need to address the conflict, and the issue that we've got at the moment with the UK government and other governments giving money for aid is very serious, because it papers over what the real issue is, which is that the conflict has not gone away.
Let me come to David Hoile, because I'd like to hear about what you have to say in response to what Olivia has drawn. Till now, as she claims, the government is blocking aid to the areas where there are camps, where there are refugees. Conflict is still very much present. The ratification of whatever deals and whatever treaties between North and South, really, they don't mask the fact that there is still a lot of strife on the ground. What do you have to say to that?
Well, I think to an extent what has been mentioned already, in fact, is actually looking at the symptoms rather than the other cause of the conflicts in both issues, in Dafur and in South, with South Sudan. I actually take issue with a large amount of what Olivia said. I think we've been hearing this a rather stuck record now for a number of years, and this in fact leads me to my main observation, which is that if there is a conflict which continues in Darfur, if there's a conflict which may actually continue in the South, actually between North and South, it continues because of the sort of claims made by a number of Western white middle-class groups and by Western governments. The war in Darfur continues because the West allows it to, because it's not imposing the necessary conditions actually for peace, and more importantly, it's actually reneging on promises it made to not just the government of Sudan, but the African Union and other interested governments in Africa to actually bring those wars to an end. They are going back on it.
So just to be clear, you're not denying the fact that there is war, but what you're saying is that the reasons for the war actually aren't to do with the government, but to do with external forces. Is that what you're saying?
Well, first of all, in terms of the war, I mean, the UNIBID commander, I think, actually 3 or 4 years ago said, the war is over. What you do have, and you have always historically had in Darfur, is a huge amount of instability. It's basically always been Sudan's Wild West or Chad's Wild East in that case. So that level actually continues. There's no coincidence that it spiked in January, just as the Qatar peace process was reaching a culmination. So, very media orientated. I'm sure it made a number of groups in England and the West very excited because they could point to the fact that war continues. This is nothing more than one level above banditry in Darfur, and it's actually aimed, as always, at destabilizing a peace process.
Mukesh, if I can come to you, and you've spent time in Sudan, you know Sudan very, very well. What would your take be? Where are we in terms of where Sudan is vis-a-vis Darfur as well as relations with the South?
I think the record is stuck, but it is stuck not by allegedly Western or foreign intervention, but because the regime in Khartoum is the same regime 10 years ago that launched the genocidal violence in Darfur. And this is why Darfur is the most successful genocide, because it continues 10 years later. Not only that, the tactics of ethnic cleansing that I witnessed for myself in Darfur 10 years ago as the head of the UN there, I witnessed for myself again when I visited the Nuba Mountains in Blue Nile earlier this year. I think to blame foreign interference for the ongoing ethnic violence in Sudan is a little bit, I think, too much. And as far as the agreement between Juba and Khartoum is concerned, it's good if the two neighbors try to resolve their differences. I think we'll all be very happy with that. But in a sense, if the underlying grievances are not addressed of the Nuba Mountains and the Blue Nile in particular at the borderlands between the two states, then I'm afraid there can be no comprehensive peace, as there can be no peace in Sudan, as long as, one, the regime continues in Khartoum. Remember, it's president indicted for crimes against humanity, and the continued violence. I think 2.5 million people is displaced as a refugee in Chad, as I saw for myself last year, can hardly be called banditry. I'm afraid the evidence on the ground is much more serious. The stories of rape, the destruction of villages. Not only that, 10 years after the initial violence in Darfur, the means for waging war, the disposal of the Khartoum regime, has actually modernized. In those days, I saw there was Janjaweed riding camels and horses. Today, they are in Toyota Land Cruisers. In those days, they had Antonovs with crude bombing. Today, they have precision-guided guided missiles and landmines and anti-personnel mines and cluster bombs, as I saw for myself in the Nuba Mountains in this case.
Olivia, Mukesh draws a very, very bleak picture. You as an NGO interested in human rights violations throughout Africa, throughout the world, but particularly in Africa, I went to Darfur on one or two occasions, and on both occasions what I saw were Western NGOs, similar to yourself, who had very noble causes at heart, who were roaming freely, moving between the refugee camps, consulting, advising, affording help and the such. Was I seeing something that wasn't really true? Was I given a picture that wasn't really true? Or, I mean, where are we now from that particular image that I saw, let's say, 4 or 5 years ago?
Well, I don't know exactly what you saw, and I can't account for that. Waging Peace's role is to represent the voice of the Darfur people. That's very much our focus. We're not talking on behalf of ourselves.
Are things better after 10 years? Are they worse? Are they the same?
They're different. No, things are different. I mean, there's no denying that in the height of the atrocities in 2003 and 2004, that's when the majority of the deaths happened, and that the numbers now are not as severe. But I would put that down to the fact that the Sudanese regime was unable to maintain that level of genocide because they knew that the international community would have to step in. What we have now is a level whereby the international community feel that they can turn their heads away, and that is unacceptable because crimes against humanity, genocide, war crimes have been committed and are continuing to be committed, but not at the same level that they were perhaps a few years back. But that's not to say that the violence isn't there, and also that the problems from the violence aren't being addressed. So these people are still living in camps. As I said earlier, they're not protected. The women are still being raped, and girls, young girls, just if they go out for firewood. And the security is appalling. So, you know, life in Darfur has not returned to normal by any means.
David, it's a very, very bleak picture, and to all accounts, or what we've heard today, the government is either deliberately perpetuating the continuation of the wave of crimes, and as Olivia put it, rape and everything that we you know, the very bleak stories that we have been hearing over the past 10 years, or at least, at best, they are impeding efforts to better the situation. What do you have to say on this?
Well, to be frank, I continue to be horrified at what I can only describe as a grotesque misrepresentation of issues. Our friends here are, along with George Bush, in effect, and one or two groups, neocon groups in the States, the only people who have continued to actually perpetuate this issue of genocide. It's a grotesque misrepresentation. Every single other organization in the world, within Africa, the European Union, no friends of Sudan at all, have said this is in no ways genocide. May well be a number of other things, but
such as?
Well, obviously, there's a war going on. Any civil war, as we all know very well, there are war crimes on both sides. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. But to continue to actually prostitute the term of genocide for political advantage is outrageous. I lost some of my family members in Europe. I find this sort of latter-day use of that term, you know, very, very offensive.
So tell me this.
But also, one last thing. Civil factors in 2008, one of the few experts, in fact the only expert really, who I recognize on Darfur is Alex Duval. 2008, he made the very simple point that more people died from gun violence in Washington, D.C. that year than died in Darfur. So to continue this old story, this old stuck record is just, you know, it's getting us nowhere.
So for the benefit of our audience, David, how would you describe the situation in Darfur right now? I mean, we've heard from Mukesh, we've heard from Olivia.
It's a very low-intensity conflict, which is in no way different from...
Fought by whom? Fought by whom? I mean, are we talking about government against Darfur rebels, the same old story from 10 years ago? Is it a different element that's fighting the war?
It's it's basically in large part what it was actually 15, 20 years ago. You have a number of ethnic groups who actually are fighting over resources within that part of the world. Other people are far better versed than I have actually said that this is actually the world's first climate change war, and I think there's a large amount of arguments in that. The war continues, the conflict continues because people in the West wish it to continue. There are groups in the West who are making millions of dollars every single year from this, including groups like Save Darfur, and to an extent also groups like the Aegis Trust, which Mr. Kapila is actually associated with. That's the tragedy of this issue.
Okay, Mukesh, I'll let you comment on this, but I have a particular question that you raised in your first statement, and that is regarding the ICC indictment. Now, unless someone is proposing that the only solution is for Western forces to actually either militarily or somehow intervene, then it must be left to the Sudanese government to sort out its own affairs. That's at least how I read it. Would that be best served with an ICC indictment hanging over the president's head, or is that not an invitation to, for the government to say, well, listen, if the world has disavowed us, then we might as well do as we wish?
I think a number of issues there. The history of conflicts around the world indicates that without a justice track to that conflict, the conflict is never resolved. Whether you talk about Sierra Leone, Angola, the Latin American conflicts, or other places, and I've been in most of them in a 30-year career working for both government, UN, and the Red Cross. So the idea that somehow the conflict in Sudan can be resolved without the accountability of the perpetrators of the crimes against humanity, including acts of genocide, not my words, words of the International Criminal Court after a due inquiry, after a referral from the Security Council. If there is no justice track to that, there is no accountability, and there is no acknowledgement of the wrongdoings, then it's not surprising that this conflict will continue. So I think the idea that this is some kind of environmental conflict is clearly absurd. 15 to 20 years ago, there have been conflicts all over on resources in many, many countries, but they don't degenerate to one side using helicopter gunships, missiles, and anti-personnel landmines. And we know that only one side of the conflict has Antonov aircraft and Sukhoi MiG fighters.
Mukesh, I read before my last trip to Sudan, I did a little bit of research, and one of the things I went back to a text back in the 30s, more than 80 years ago, and it spoke of a conflict in Darfur. It spoke of people killing each other. It spoke of I forget the exact term, but the history-long, ancient-long conflict between grazers and between the landowners and the such. This has been around for many, many years. Why hang it on the neck of this particular government?
No, conflict has been there in Sudan and other communities for generations. And these are the natural conflicts that happen between communities as they adjust to each other, as they compete for resources, and so on and so forth. However, the nature of the modern conflict in Sudan, which starts at this phase of at least, started 10 years ago in Dafur, is of a completely different nature. Traditional conflict resolution mechanisms were when different groups and tribes settled their differences, they married each other, they kind of made compromises, and life went on. But what the Sudan regime has done, the Khartoum regime of al-Bashir has done, is actually industrialize the conflict. Introduce modern weaponry, deliberately armed one side, the Arab side, and using an ethnic strategy of targeting the black African tribes, turned what would be traditional disputes into very much a modern form of ethnocide or genocide.
Okay, if I may, I'd like to talk a little bit, I'd like to move on from this particularly. I'll come back to you, David, and allow you to come back to Mukesh. But Olivia, I'd like to talk a little bit about aid, because in the introduction you heard that Britain has allocated 67 or 57 million pounds in aid, particularly to Darfur. Now, once again, we come back to this whole argument about whether such aid is of use, is beneficial. From the moral point of view, it's not black and white. From the efficacy point of view, it's not black and white. Where do you stand on this?
My view is an aid clearly is useful for people who are forced to live in these appalling conditions in camps. The problem is that by attending the Doha conference, the UK and other governments are giving the Sudanese government the idea that they are engaging with them, that they support them, and the Sudanese government has gone out and told the world that, and they feel that their acts in Darfur and in South Kordofan are being overlooked. Now, focusing on aid, as I say, is completely papering over and refocusing away from what the important issue is. And the fighting will only be solved with a political solution. So aid at the moment is not the appropriate way forward.
What's the political solution that you have in mind that would solve this problem?
A proper peace agreement which recognises the interests of all the different communities within Sudan.
But I'm not an expert on Sudanese affairs, but I can still remember peace agreement after peace agreement signed by, Ghazi Salah ad-Din and foreign ministers of old, Muslims and Christians, some of whom, and what has that brought? I mean, in your eyes, that brought nothing.
Peace agreements can only lead to something if people stick to them. And the Khartoum government that we have at the moment is renowned for its ability to sign endless documents and then walk away and do absolutely nothing about it. So yes, I'm with you that a peace agreement that is not adhered to is meaningless. A peace agreement that is meaningful and gives political autonomy to the marginalised people who've been suffering for all these years, that's meaningful.
David?
Well, just on that last point, I think that's once again absolutely unfair and untrue. The single most important peace agreement signed in the last number of years was the comprehensive peace agreement, whereby the North voluntarily gave independence to the South. So I don't think they actually walked away from that. I think that's just wishful thinking. The 2 points I'd like to make in response to Dr. Kapila's points. One is that, again, he actually takes a very characteristically shorthand approach. He says, oh, well, the ICC have said that there is genocide. Anyone who knows the ICC, and I don't actually recognize them myself, but the ICC pre-trial chamber has said there might possibly be grounds for the charges. It should be sorted out at the trial chamber stage. So, I mean, unless a presumption of innocence has actually vanished from the Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence, that's once again one of these misrepresentations. The other issue, this sort of mantra that there must be justice before peace, seems to only be applied to black people, because we have a perfect example of where people chose to draw a line in the sand in Northern Ireland. And in fact, the parallels between Darfur and Northern Ireland are very stark. Both are the westernmost parts of their countries. The British government was and has consistently been accused of arming militias, death squads within Northern Ireland. In fact, I look at the UVF, the UDA, and so on and so forth. In Northern Ireland, you had the biggest displacement of civilian population groups since the war in Europe. Thousands of people have been killed or injured. There are thousands of people who've actually been affected, who are victims of that war. And the highest ranking government official or soldier actually convicted of anything in Britain was a corporal. So it's okay for the people of Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom to actually put peace before justice in that context, but it's not okay in a similar conflict, in effect, all the same ingredients in Africa. And this is now what Africa are actually rebelling about.
Mukesh, in one word, the government sticking to a secession date, carrying it out, and then offering half its land almost to an independent state, that surely shows of a government that the world can deal with, no?
I think it's a little bit of exaggeration to say that the government in Khartoum voluntarily gave it up. I think a very heavy pressure was put on them, including American sanctions, including many other things. And the comprehensive peace agreement, so-called, was neither comprehensive nor peace. If it was, we wouldn't have the conflicts now. Okay. And it wasn't comprehensive of peace because it neglected the legitimate demands of the marginalized people of the Nuba Mountains and Blue Nile.
I will have to cut this short, unfortunately. We could go on, and I'm pretty sure we will come back to revisit this particular issue. But thank you very much, Olivia, Mukesh and David. Thank you very much for joining us. And thank you for tuning in. Join us next week when I'm sure we'll be debating 2 or more extremely interesting issues. So thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. I'm Anas Al-Tikriti.